My name is Margaret, and I am 78 years old. 3 days before my grandson's wedding, I signed my name at the bottom of a contract for a wedding venue and a catering hall, the same way I had signed dozens of checks and contracts for my family over the last 12 years, quietly, without asking for thanks. Hours after my daughter-in-law told me I was not welcome at that wedding, I picked up the telephone and cancelled every part of it, the venue, the food, all of it in one afternoon. I did not raise my voice when I did it. I did not slam a door or throw a single plate. I simply stopped paying for the party that had no room for me in it, and that is where this story really begins, though it took me most of a lifetime to get to that phone call. I live in a small house on Maple Court, in a quiet part of Dayton, Ohio, the same house my late husband Robert and I bought back when a starter home still meant something modest and honest. Robert passed away 12 years ago, and since then, I have been the one who holds this family together financially, quietly, from behind the scenes, the way a lot of grandmothers do without anyone ever really noticing. I paid for my son James's kitchen renovation the year he lost his job. I paid for 2 semesters of my grandson Tyler's college tuition when the loan paperwork fell through. I told myself that was simply what a mother and later a grandmother was supposed to do for her family. Have you ever given everything you had to people who only seemed to remember you existed when they needed something from your bank account? If you are listening to this on your lunch break, or driving home from a long shift, or lying awake because your own mind will not let you rest, I want you to know you are not imagining what has been done to you. If this story sounds familiar already, even in this first minute, please consider subscribing to this channel. It costs you nothing, it takes 3 seconds, and it genuinely helps an older woman like me keep sharing these stories with people who need to hear them. Now let me tell you what happened at my grandson's wedding. My grandson Tyler is the light of my life in a way that is hard to explain unless you have raised a child yourself and then watched that child raise a child of his own. When Tyler was young, before his father, James, remarried, before there was a stepmother in the picture at all, Tyler used to spend every Sunday afternoon at my kitchen table, doing homework, while I made pot roast. He called me Nana. He still calls me Nana, actually, though something in the way he says it now sounds thinner, more like a habit than an embrace, ever since his father married a woman named Vanessa 9 years ago. Vanessa is not a cruel woman on the surface. She smiles at church functions. She sends a card at Christmas with her name printed in gold script. But from nearly the first year of her marriage to my son James, I understood that Vanessa saw family the way some people see a ledger, a column of debits and credits, and in her ledger I occupied a very specific line. I was useful. I was generous. I was, in her words once, spoken carelessly at a birthday dinner when she thought I was in the other room. Quite convenient to have around, given how much she likes to help out with money. When Tyler called me last spring to tell me he was engaged to a wonderful young woman named Emily, I cried real tears sitting right here at my kitchen table, the same table where he used to do his math homework. I told him that whatever he needed for that wedding, I wanted to be part of it. Not as an obligation, but as a gift from a grandmother who had watched him grow into a good man. I meant every word of that promise, and for a while it felt like the most natural thing in the world, my last great gift to a boy I had helped raise almost as much as his own parents had. I want to pause here and tell you something my own mother used to say. Back on the farm where I grew up outside of Columbus, she used to say that a family will always show you, eventually, exactly how much they think you are worth. Not in the words they use at holidays, but in the moments when they think nobody smaller than themselves is watching. I did not understand that sentence fully until I was well past 70 years old. I understood the words. I did not understand the weight of them, not until they were pressed directly against my own chest in the days before that wedding. If a small part of you is nodding along right now, if some memory of your own family has already come to mind, take a moment and just breathe with me for a second before we go on, because what comes next is not easy to tell, and I imagine it will not be easy to hear either. I promise you it ends the way it needs to end, with dignity intact, mine and I hope yours as well. Stay with me through this story because there is a version of strength in it that nobody ever taught me in 78 years of living until this one wedding forced me to learn it in a single week. The venue Tyler and Emily wanted was a place called Wellington Manor. a restored 19th century estate just outside Dayton with a ballroom, a stone terrace, and gardens that in early June look like something out of a painting. The rental fee alone came to $19,000, a number that made Emily's parents go quiet at the first planning dinner, since they run a small hardware store and had already stretched themselves thin on the rehearsal dinner. I remember looking at Tyler's face across that table, hopeful and a little embarrassed, and I remember hearing myself say, before I had even finished thinking it through, that I would be honored to cover the venue myself. I want to be honest with you. Part of me offered that money because I loved my grandson beyond measure, and part of me offered it because for years being the one who could help, being needed in that particular way, was the closest thing I had to feeling essential inside this family. Robert had been gone 12 years by then. My days were quiet, my house was quiet, and an invitation into the middle of something as big and joyful as a wedding felt at the time like being pulled back into the center of my own life. I did not see, not yet, how easily that gift could be turned into the very reason I would later be pushed back out to the edges of it. The following week I sat down with Linda Hayes, the woman who has managed the events side of Wellington Manor for over 20 years and who I first met decades ago through a church fundraiser committee. Linda remembered me fondly, remembered Robert too, and treated me the way people used to treat clients before everything became automated and cold. We signed the venue contract together at her office, my name printed clearly at the top as the responsible party and the sole account holder, my personal check covering the full deposit that very afternoon. Linda mentioned, almost in passing, that as the account holder, I retained the right to modify or cancel the booking up until 72 hours before the event, without needing anyone else's signature or permission. I did not think much of that detail at the time. Why would I? I was not planning to cancel my own grandson's wedding. I was simply a woman signing a contract the way I had signed dozens of contracts before for orthodontist bills and car repairs and 100 smaller family emergencies over the years. But I want you to remember that detail because it becomes the quiet hinge this entire story turns on later, the plain, unglamorous fact that my name, and only my name, sat at the top of that paperwork, with my signature as the only one that mattered to the business itself. A month after the venue was settled, I offered to cover catering as well, once I overheard Vanessa on the phone telling her sister that the caterer they actually wanted, a well-regarded company called Rosewood Fine Catering, was simply out of the family's price range. Rosewood was known around Dayton for a beautiful plated dinner service, the kind with a carving station and a dessert table modeled after a small bakery display, and their quote came to just over $24,000 for 140 guests. I called Rosewood myself the next morning and signed that contract too, again in my own name, again paid in full from the retirement account Robert and I had built together over 35 years of marriage. Between the venue and the catering, I had committed $43,000 of my own savings to my grandson's wedding, a significant portion of what Robert and I had set aside for what we always called, half-joking, our rainy day fund. I did not tell most of the family the exact number. I did not want anyone to feel indebted to me or to treat the gift as a transaction instead of an act of love. I only wanted Tyler to walk into that beautiful stone ballroom on his wedding day and feel, for one afternoon, like nothing in the world could touch him or his new bride. And for a while, that is exactly what I believed I was building for him. It was around this time, late summer, that I first noticed I was no longer being invited to the actual planning meetings, the ones where menus were finalized and seating charts were argued over. At first I told myself it was simply an oversight, that everyone was busy, that these things happen in large families with many moving parts. Vanessa had taken over as the unofficial wedding coordinator almost from the beginning, which made sense since she enjoyed that kind of organizing and had more free time than James, who works long hours managing a regional distribution warehouse. I did not think there was anything sinister in it yet. I simply noticed the way you notice a chair has been moved slightly out of place in a room you know very well. By early autumn, the pattern had become impossible to ignore, even for a woman who has spent a lifetime giving people the benefit of the doubt. There was a tasting dinner at Rosewood Fine Catering that I only learned about after it had already happened, mentioned casually by Emily's mother at a grocery store checkout line, as though I obviously already knew. There was a meeting with the florist that Tyler mentioned in passing, assuming I had been there in spirit, if not in person. Each missed moment on its own seemed small enough to excuse. Stacked together over 3 or 4 months, they began to form the outline of something I did not yet want to name out loud, even to myself, sitting alone at my own kitchen table. I remember calling Vanessa directly in October, as gently as I could manage, simply asking if there was a planning meeting I could join, since I wanted to be helpful with more than money if that was possible. Vanessa's voice on the phone was warm in that particular way that made the words underneath it land even colder. She told me the planning meetings were mostly logistics, seating charts and vendor calls, nothing a woman my age would find enjoyable or even easy to follow, given how complicated these modern weddings had become with online systems and spreadsheets. She said it kindly, almost sweetly, the way you might explain to a child why they cannot ride the tallest roller coaster at the fair. I sat with that phone call for a long time afterward, turning the words over the way you turn a stone over in your palm, checking every side of it for something sharp. A woman my age. Not simple to follow. I had managed a household budget for 50 years, raised 2 children, buried a husband, and balanced my own retirement portfolio with a calculator and a legal pad well into my 70s, and yet somehow I had become, in the span of 1 wedding season, a woman who could not be trusted to sit through a meeting about tablecloths and flower arrangements. I did not argue with Vanessa on that call. I thanked her for explaining, and I hung up the phone, and then I sat very still in my kitchen for almost an hour. I want to tell you honestly, since I promised you honesty at the start of this story, that I did not immediately suspect I would be excluded from the wedding itself. Even after that phone call, even after the missed tastings and the quiet reshuffling of who mattered and who did not, some part of me still believed that, on the actual day, none of these small slights would matter, because family, at the end of everything, still shows up for family. I believed that the way you believe the sun will rise without needing proof, simply because it always had before. I did not yet understand how thoroughly that belief was about to be tested. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being generous inside a family that has quietly decided you are no longer essential to its story, only to its spreadsheet. I felt it most sharply in November, at Thanksgiving, when Vanessa's own mother, a woman I had met perhaps 3 times, was seated at the head of the table for the wedding-related toast, while I sat further down near my grandson Tyler, who squeezed my hand under the tablecloth without saying anything at all. He knew, even at 26 years old, even distracted by his own happiness, some part of my grandson knew something in the arrangement of that family had shifted, and he did not have the courage yet, or perhaps the vocabulary, to say so out loud to his father or to his fiancée. I remember driving home from that Thanksgiving dinner alone, the radio off, the road quiet, replaying that toast in my mind the way you replay a scene from a film you cannot quite believe you were actually part of. I thought about the checks I had written for that very dining room table, the one Vanessa's family now gathered around so comfortably, a small kitchen renovation loan I had covered for James years earlier without a second thought. I did not resent the giving itself. What sat heavy in my chest was simpler and sadder than resentment, the plain sense that gratitude in that house had a shelf life, and mine, it seemed, had quietly expired some time after the money had already changed hands. If you have ever sat at a table you helped pay for and felt like a stranger in your own family story, I want you to know that feeling has a name, and it is not weakness, and it is not being overly sensitive the way some people will tell you when you try to explain it. It is the accurate, painful recognition of a boundary being drawn around you without your consent. I did not have language for it back then either, not fully, but I felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the rain actually falls. A pressure behind the ribs that tells you something is coming, something you cannot yet name but will recognize instantly the moment it finally arrives. By December, comments about my age had become almost routine, delivered lightly, the way people say cruel things when they have practiced saying them enough times to believe they are simply being practical. Vanessa mentioned at a family dinner meant to discuss the rehearsal schedule. that she worried about how a long ceremony, followed by a longer reception, might be hard on someone my age, standing and mingling for hours in unfamiliar shoes. She said it while looking at James, not at me, as though I were a piece of furniture being discussed for placement rather than a woman sitting 3 feet away with a full glass of water in front of her. I told myself that night driving home from James's house in the dark that I would not let one comment or even a dozen comments poison something as important as my grandson's wedding day. I told myself I was strong enough and dignified enough to simply let the small cruelties slide off me like rain off a good coat, the way I had let so many small cruelties slide off me over 78 years of living in a world that does not always know what to do with an opinionated older woman. What I did not yet understand was that these comments were not random. They were a slow, deliberate rehearsal for something much larger that was already being planned without my knowledge, somewhere in the back channels of that family. In January, Tyler came to my house alone one Sunday afternoon, the way he used to when he was small and sat at my kitchen table while I made him a cup of coffee he barely touched. He told me haltingly that Vanessa had suggested to his father that the wedding might go more smoothly, quote, without any awkward moments, if the guest list on the day of stayed, quote, tight and manageable. He said it carefully, watching my face for a reaction, and I understood immediately with a clarity that felt almost physical that I was being tested for how I would react to an idea that had already, somewhere behind closed doors, been decided. I did not cry in front of my grandson that afternoon. I asked him as calmly as I could manage whether his father James had said anything himself about wanting me there, or whether this was entirely Vanessa's idea being floated through him as a kind of trial balloon. Tyler admitted, looking down at his coffee cup, that his father had gone quiet during that conversation, the way James always goes quiet when Vanessa states something firmly, a habit my son developed early in that marriage and never seemed able to break, even when the thing being stated firmly concerned his own mother's place at his son's wedding. I noticed, watching Tyler's hands wrap around that untouched coffee cup, how much he still resembled the small boy who used to sit at that very spot, swinging his feet under the table because they did not yet reach the floor. I wanted badly to reach across the table and tell him none of this was his burden to carry, that a 26-year-old man should not have to referee a quiet war between his grandmother and his stepmother in the weeks before his own wedding. I said as much out loud, gently, and watched some of the tension leave his shoulders, though I could tell the tightness in his jaw did not fully disappear that afternoon, and would not, I suspected, until this whole matter had been settled one way or another. I told Tyler that whatever happened, whatever his father and Vanessa decided, I loved him without any condition attached to it, and that nothing about a seating chart or a guest list would ever change that simple fact. I meant it completely, but after he left that afternoon, I sat alone in my quiet house on Maple Court and allowed myself, for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun, to actually cry, not out of self-pity, but out of a grief that felt strangely similar to the grief I had felt 12 years earlier, standing beside Robert's casket, the grief of losing something I had assumed, wrongly, could never be taken away from me. If you have ever felt yourself slowly written out of your own family's story, one small comment and one missed invitation at a time, I want you to pause here with me and just breathe for a moment. This part of the story is hard, and it does not get easier before it gets harder still. But I promise you, there is a turn coming, a moment where the truth of what was happening became impossible for anyone in that family to deny, and I want you here with me when it arrives. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, this is a good moment to do it, quietly, at no cost to you, simply so these stories keep reaching the people who need to hear that they are not alone in living them. Through February and into March, I began, almost without meaning to, keeping better records of everything I had paid for. I am not proud to admit that a small, cautious part of my mind had started preparing for something before I consciously allowed myself to believe it was necessary. I gathered the venue contract with Wellington Manor into a manila folder in my desk drawer, the catering agreement with Rosewood beside it, along with copies of every check I had written and every deposit receipt Linda Hayes had mailed to my house over the previous year. I told myself I was simply being organized, the way I have always been organized about money. a habit Robert used to tease me about affectionately for 35 years of marriage. In April, at what was supposed to be a joyful cake tasting, I learned, again secondhand, this time from Emily's own mother, who assumed I already knew, that a limousine service had been booked for the wedding procession. A vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud rented through a company called Heritage Classic Cars in nearby Columbus, at a cost of nearly $3,000 for the day. Nobody had asked whether I wanted to contribute to that particular flourish, which felt oddly like a relief after everything else, one small corner of this wedding where my checkbook was not, apparently, required for the family's vision of the perfect day to come together. I sat with Emily's mother for a moment at that cake tasting, two women neither of whom seemed to be fully welcome inside Vanessa's version of how this wedding should run, and something passed between us that did not need many words. She squeezed my hand and told me quietly that she thought I was a remarkable woman for how much I'd given this family, and that whatever was happening beneath the surface, she hoped I knew my generosity had not gone unnoticed by everyone. It was a small kindness from someone who barely knew me, and it stayed with me for weeks afterward, a single warm thread in a season that had otherwise gone increasingly cold. I remember standing beside that gleaming Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, when Heritage Classic Cars brought it by Wellington Manor for a walkthrough a few weeks later, its deep burgundy paint catching the afternoon light, a small crystal vase mounted on the interior door meant to hold a single white rose for the bride. Tyler ran his hand along the hood the way boys do with things they cannot quite believe belong, even for a day, to their own lives, and for a moment I saw in his face the same wonder he used to show me over a new bicycle at 8 years old. I found myself thinking, watching him, that all of this beauty, the car, the ballroom, the flowers, meant absolutely nothing if the people who loved him most could not stand together and watch him ride away in it. By May, 3 weeks before the wedding, the final invoices came due, both from Wellington Manor and from Rosewood Fine Catering, the last major payments that would settle each contract in full ahead of the June ceremony. I paid both without hesitation, transferring the remaining balance from my retirement account the same week I received each invoice, the way I had always paid every bill in my life, promptly and without complaint. Linda Hayes called to thank me personally, mentioning again, almost as an aside, that the account remained fully in my name and that any changes, additions, or cancellations would need to come directly through me as the responsible party on file, a small administrative detail that suddenly felt heavier than it had a year earlier. I remember hanging up that phone call with Linda and standing in my kitchen for a long moment, looking out at the small garden Robert and I had planted together decades ago, the tomatoes just starting to come in for the summer. Something in me had shifted without my fully choosing it, a quiet recalibration between the woman who gives without condition and the woman who understands, finally, at 78 years old, that generosity without any boundary at all is not virtue. It is simply an invitation for people to keep taking. I did not yet know I would need that recalibration within the month. I only knew, standing there among my tomato plants, that something inside me had finally, gently hardened. 2 weeks before the wedding, Vanessa called me directly for what she described as a quick logistics conversation, her voice pleasant and businesslike, in a way that immediately put me on guard, the way an experienced sailor senses a shift in the wind before the storm clouds have even gathered on the horizon. She explained that the final head count for the ceremony and reception needed to be locked in, and that given how tight seating had become at Wellington Manor's ballroom, some difficult decisions were being made about, quote, which guests made the most sense for the day of events. I asked her plainly whether this conversation concerned me. Vanessa paused on the phone, a pause that told me everything before she said a single additional word. She told me, in a tone she likely believed was gentle, that she and James had discussed it at length, and that given some, quote, incidents at prior family gatherings, and given how overwhelming a full wedding day could be for someone my age, they thought it might be best for everyone's comfort, including my own, if I attended only a smaller gathering afterward, rather than the ceremony and reception itself. I asked her, my voice steady though my hands were not, what incidents she was referring to specifically. She could not name a single one. I sat on my back porch that evening after that phone call, the same porch where Robert and I used to drink coffee every morning before he passed, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened without rushing to soften it or explain it away. I had given this family $43,000 toward a wedding I had just been told, politely and with false concern for my comfort, that I would not be permitted to attend. I thought of every Sunday afternoon at my kitchen table, with young Tyler doing his homework, every check I had written, without asking a single question in return. And I understood, finally and completely, exactly what my role in this family had quietly become over the past 9 years. That night I did not sleep much, and in the grey hour before dawn I found myself back at my kitchen table, that same manila folder open in front of me, the venue contract and the catering agreement spread out under the light of the small lamp Robert had given me for our 30th anniversary. I read through both documents slowly, not with anger yet, but with the careful attention of a woman who had spent decades reading fine print before signing anything, whether it was a mortgage or a car loan, or a simple service agreement for lawn care. And there it was again, in plain, unremarkable language, the same clause Linda Hayes had mentioned nearly a year earlier, almost in passing. Both contracts specified clearly that as the sole account holder and responsible party, I retained the right to cancel, modify, or otherwise adjust either booking at any point up until the event itself with full refund eligibility if cancelled more than 72 hours in advance, and a more limited but still real cancellation right, forfeiting only the deposit already paid at any point up until the actual event began. Nobody else's name appeared anywhere on either document. Not James's name, not Vanessa's name, not even Tyler's name, the very groom this wedding was meant to celebrate. Only mine, printed clearly at the top of every page, exactly where I had placed it, months earlier, out of love rather than strategy. I sat with those documents for a long while in that grey light, tracing the printed lines with one finger the way Robert used to trace figures on our old tax forms every spring, muttering happily to himself about deductions. I thought about the woman I had been at 50, at 60, always the first to reach for her checkbook whenever a grandchild needed braces or a roof needed patching, and I wondered, honestly, whether that woman would have noticed this clause at all, or whether she simply would have signed wherever she was told to sign, grateful only to be included in the plans. Something in me, sitting there at 78, no longer wanted to be that grateful, unquestioning signature at the bottom of someone else's page. I did not decide that morning, in that grey hour before dawn, to cancel anything. I want to be honest with you about that, because I do not want you to think of me as a woman plotting revenge in the dark. I simply understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that I possessed a kind of power in this situation that nobody in my family had bothered to consider, likely because they had spent so many years viewing my generosity as a fixed permanent feature of the landscape, something as reliable and unremarkable as the sunrise, never once imagining that the woman behind that generosity still had a will and a spine entirely her own. The following Monday, I drove to Wellington Manor and sat down with Linda Hayes in her small office overlooking the terrace where my grandson's ceremony was meant to take place in 11 days. I did not tell her everything yet. I simply asked her, plainly, to confirm the exact terms of my cancellation rights as the account holder, the precise deadlines, the precise financial consequences at each stage as the wedding date drew closer. Linda answered every question directly and without judgment, the way a long-time professional does, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation I watched her expression shift slightly, as though she understood, without my needing to explain a single detail, that something difficult was unfolding inside my family. Linda has known me for over 20 years, long enough to have watched me raise money for the church roof fund, long enough to remember Robert's laugh from summer picnics decades ago, and long enough, apparently, to recognize the particular kind of quiet that settles over a woman who has finally decided something important. She did not push me for details that day. She simply told me gently that whatever I decided to do with my own contract, on my own account, using my own money, was entirely my right, and that she would support whatever choice I made without question, the same way she always had. I thanked her, and I drove home with a strange settled calm I had not felt in months. On the drive home from Wellington Manor that Monday, I stopped at the small diner on Route 4 where Robert and I used to eat breakfast every Saturday morning for nearly 3 decades, and I sat alone in our old corner booth with a cup of coffee I barely touched. I found myself talking to him quietly, the way I sometimes still do when a decision feels too large to carry by myself, telling him about the contracts, about the text message, about the particular ache of being useful without being wanted. I do not know if he heard me wherever he is now, but saying the words out loud in that familiar booth made the decision forming inside me feel less like an act of anger and more like something he himself would have quietly, steadily supported. I want to pause here again, because I know this next part of the story is the part many of you have been waiting to hear, and I do not want to rush toward it carelessly. Everything that happens next happened because a family mistook my love for an unlimited resource, something that would always simply be there regardless of how it was treated. If you have ever been treated that way yourself, valued only for what you provide, and quietly erased from the moments that matter most, I want you to know that recognizing your own power, calmly and without cruelty, is not bitterness. It is simply, finally, remembering that you were a whole person all along, not just a line item in someone else's plans. In the final week before the wedding, I said very little to anyone in my family about what I now understood clearly to be true. I attended one last small family dinner at James and Vanessa's house, where the wedding was discussed constantly around me as though I were merely a piece of the furniture, present but not truly included in the conversation. Tyler seemed distracted and happy in the particular way a groom is meant to be in his final days as a single man, and I did not want to burden him with the full weight of what his mother figure Vanessa had arranged not yet. Not until it became absolutely necessary for him to know the truth of it. 3 days before the ceremony, I received a text message from Vanessa. Not a phone call, not a conversation in person, simply a text message sent at 9:15 in the evening while I was watching the local news in my own living room. It read, and I remember every word of it precisely, that after careful thought, she and James had decided it would be best for me to skip the ceremony and reception entirely, and instead join the family for a smaller, quote, low-key lunch 2 days after the wedding, once things had settled down and everyone could relax without added pressure on the actual day. I read that message 3 times before I fully absorbed what it meant. Not a seat near the back. Not a compromise about the reception without the ceremony, a complete removal from the day itself, communicated the same way you might cancel a dentist appointment, brief and final and utterly without room for discussion. I sat with my phone in my lap for a long time that evening, the local weather forecast playing quietly in the background, and I felt something inside my chest that was not quite anger yet, something closer to a very old, very deep sadness. The particular sadness of understanding exactly how little you have come to mean to people you built an entire life around loving. I did not respond to that text message that night. I turned off the television, and I sat alone in my quiet house on Maple Court, and I allowed myself finally to grieve the version of this wedding I had imagined for over a year, the version where I sat in the front row watching my grandson marry the young woman he loved, wearing the blue dress I had already picked out for the occasion, the version where my $43,000 had been an act of pure joy rather than the foundation for my own quiet erasure. That grief was real, and I do not want to minimize it for the sake of telling a tidier story. Some losses deserve to be fully felt before any decision follows them. The morning of the wedding, I woke early, out of old habit more than anything else, and for a moment in that first hazy minute between sleep and waking, I forgot entirely what Vanessa's text message had said, and I nearly reached for the blue dress hanging pressed and ready in my closet. Then the memory returned, all at once, the way cold water returns feeling to a numb hand, and I sat on the edge of my bed for several long minutes, simply breathing, the dress still hanging there, the small wrapped gift for Tyler and Emily still sitting on my dresser, where I had placed it a week earlier, ready and now entirely unnecessary. I made myself a cup of coffee that morning and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Tyler had done his homework as a boy, the same table where I had spread out those contracts in the gray hour before dawn, weeks earlier. I looked at the clock. The ceremony at Wellington Manor was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon, with the reception dinner from Rosewood Fine Catering to follow immediately after. I thought about calling James directly, one final attempt to appeal to whatever remained of the boy I had raised inside the man he had become, but something in me, quiet and clear, told me that conversation would change nothing, not after everything that had already been decided without me. Instead, sitting at that same kitchen table, still in my nightgown, my coffee going cold beside me, I picked up the telephone and called Linda Hayes at Wellington Manor. It was 10:30 in the morning, 3.5 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I told her, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, that I needed to exercise my rights as the account holder and cancel the venue booking effective immediately. Linda was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she asked me gently whether I was certain, whether there was anything she could do to help resolve whatever had happened instead of taking this particular step. I told Linda the truth, plainly and without embellishment, that I had just been told, 3 days earlier, by text message that I was not welcome at my own grandson's wedding, a wedding I had personally paid $19,000 to make possible at her venue. I told her I was not doing this out of anger, or at least not only out of anger, but out of a simple, calm refusal to keep financing the exact event that had been used to erase me from my own family's most important day. Linda was quiet again, and then she said softly that she understood completely, and that she would process the cancellation within the hour as her contract with me required. After hanging up with Linda, I called Rosewood Fine Catering next and spoke with the events manager there, a kind young man named Stephen, who had coordinated the tasting I had never actually attended myself. I explained the situation to him in the same plain terms I had used with Linda, and I told him I needed to cancel the catering contract for that afternoon's reception, effective immediately, exercising my rights as the account holder on file. Stephen, to his credit, did not argue with me or lecture me about the short notice. He simply confirmed my identity on the account, processed the cancellation, and told me he was sorry the day had come to this for our family. By 11:15 that morning, both cancellations were confirmed in writing, sent to my email exactly as the contracts had promised they would be. Plain, business-like confirmations that the venue booking and the catering contract for that afternoon's wedding had been terminated at the request of the account holder. I sat at my kitchen table with those 2 emails open in front of me, and I did not feel triumphant, not in the way you might expect from a story like this one. I felt mostly a strange and heavy quiet, the particular quiet of a woman who has just told the truth to herself for the first time in a very long while. Word reached the wedding party, I later learned, sometime around noon, when Wellington Manor's staff began quietly disassembling the ceremony chairs that had been set up on the terrace since early that morning, informing the on-site wedding planner that the booking had been officially cancelled by the account holder just after 10:30. Vanessa, according to Tyler, who told me all of this himself 2 days later, went pale, then furious, then frantic, calling the venue directly, demanding an explanation, only to be told, calmly and correctly, that the account was in my name and that the cancellation had come from me, and that there was nothing the staff could do to reverse a decision that was entirely within my legal right to make. Tyler described it to me, later, almost like watching a house of cards come down in slow motion, the florist's van pulling into the circular driveway at Wellington Manor, just as a staff member was folding the last of the white ceremony chairs, the 2 of them standing awkwardly beside a stack of peony arrangements nobody could explain what to do with. Emily, still in her robe at her parents' house, learned the news from her own mother's frantic phone call, and according to Tyler, sat down hard on her bed and simply laughed, a strange, disbelieving laugh, before the reality of the morning fully settled over her, and the laughter turned quietly into tears. Within the hour, Rosewood Fine Catering's kitchen, already 3 hours into preparing the plated dinner for 140 guests, received the same cancellation confirmation. And, according to what Emily's mother told me later, the catering vans that were meant to arrive at Wellington Manor by 1 o'clock simply never left the Rosewood parking lot at all. There was no venue left to receive them. There was no contract left to fulfill. The wedding that Vanessa had spent a year meticulously planning down to the smallest floral detail suddenly had no ballroom, no reception dinner, and within a few more frantic hours an increasingly small window of time in which to find any solution whatsoever. James called me at 12:45 that afternoon, his voice cracking in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager who had wrecked his first car. He asked me, almost pleading, whether I had really cancelled everything, whether there was any way to undo it, whether I understood what this meant for his son's wedding day. I told my son, as calmly as I could manage, that yes, I had cancelled it, that I had done so using my own money and my own name and my own legal right as the person who had paid for every part of it, and that I understood completely what it meant, because someone had made very sure, 3 days earlier, that I would understand exactly where I stood in this family before making that decision myself. There was a long silence on the phone after I said that, and in that silence I could hear, faintly, Vanessa's voice in the background, sharp and rising, and somewhere beneath it, quieter, I thought I could hear Tyler asking someone what exactly was happening, why the florist's van had just turned around in the driveway. James asked me, his voice smaller now, whether there was anything at all I could do to help fix things given the hour. I told him, gently but without wavering, that I was not the one who had broken this day. I had simply finally stopped paying to be broken by it. And that distinction, I told my son, mattered a great deal to me, even if it was inconvenient for everyone else at that particular moment. By early afternoon, the family had scrambled to relocate the ceremony to Emily's parents' modest backyard, a lovely space in its own right, but nothing like the stone terrace and manicured gardens of Wellington Manor, with folding chairs borrowed from a neighbor and a simple sheet cake from the grocery store standing in for the elaborate dessert table Rosewood had originally promised. I did not attend that improvised ceremony, and nobody notably called to invite me to it once the original plan collapsed, which told me everything I still needed to know about how quickly my role in that family reverted under pressure, right back to exactly where it had been before any of this began. Tyler called me that evening after the makeshift ceremony was over, his voice exhausted and raw, in a way that broke my heart even as it also, quietly, confirmed everything I had decided that morning. He told me he understood now, fully for the first time, exactly what had been done to me, and that he was ashamed he had not stood up for me sooner, ashamed he had let his father's silence and Vanessa's firm certainty steer the family away from the woman who had shown up for him unconditionally his entire life. I told him I loved him regardless of any of it, and that his shame, while understandable, was not something I needed him to carry for my sake. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened moved quickly through the extended family, as these things always do, each retelling adding its own small distortion. Some painting me as a cruel old woman who had ruined her own grandson's wedding out of spite, others recognizing more accurately that a woman who had given $43,000 in good faith had simply, at last, declined to keep financing her own humiliation. I did not correct every version of the story. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I no longer needed everyone in that family to see me the way I wanted to be seen. I only needed to see myself clearly, and for the first time in years I finally did. James came to my house alone about a week after the wedding and sat at my kitchen table without Vanessa beside him for the first time in longer than I could remember. He apologized, haltingly, admitting that he had gone along with Vanessa's plan largely out of exhaustion and a desire to avoid conflict in his own marriage, rather than out of any genuine belief that I did not belong at my own grandson's wedding. I told my son that I appreciated the apology and that I loved him, but that love and unconditional financial support were two very different things, and that going forward, I intended to keep both of those things more carefully separated than I had allowed myself to for the past 12 years. I did not demand the $43,000 back from anyone, and I want to be clear about that, since some people hearing this story assume that money must have been the point all along. It was never about the money itself. It was about being treated finally as a person with feelings and dignity rather than a convenient source of funds who could be excluded from the very event she made possible. I told James plainly that I would not be funding any future gathering, wedding or otherwise that Vanessa organized without my presence being considered as valuable as my checkbook. And my son, to his credit, did not argue with that particular boundary. Emily, my grandson's new wife, reached out to me personally about 10 days after the wedding, apologizing for a decision she said she had genuinely known nothing about until the morning everything collapsed. I believed her, and I told her so. And I told her that I hoped sincerely that her marriage to Tyler would be built on something sturdier than the assumptions Vanessa had made about who deserved a seat at that particular table. Emily cried a little on the phone and told me she hoped I would still consider myself her grandmother too, now that she had married into this family, and I told her that I would gladly on the condition that our relationship was built on honesty rather than convenience going forward. Emily told me something during that call that stayed with me for a long time afterward, that she had actually asked Vanessa, weeks before the wedding, why I was not present at any of the planning meetings, and had been told simply that I preferred to stay out of the details and trusted the younger generation to handle it. She said she had believed that explanation completely, having no reason yet to doubt her new mother-in-law, and that learning the truth of it, the actual text message, the actual timeline, had left her furious on my behalf in a way she had not expected to feel towards someone she barely knew. I told her that her honesty, freely given now, meant more to me than any apology Vanessa herself might one day offer. Vanessa never apologized to me directly, not in any meaningful way, though James told me she had softened somewhat in private conversations at home, admitting at least to him that she had underestimated both my resolve and the plain legal reality of whose name sat at the top of those contracts. I do not need her apology in order to move forward with my own life, and I have made a kind of peace with the likelihood that she and I will simply coexist carefully at future family gatherings, polite but no longer pretending toward a warmth that was never truly there between us to begin with, a small, quiet honesty I actually find easier to live with. I want to tell you clearly, because I think this matters more than the drama of the cancelled venue itself, that I have not closed my heart to my grandson or to this family as a whole. Tyler and Emily came to visit me last month, sitting at my kitchen table, just as Tyler used to, as a boy, and we talked for hours about their small apartment, about Tyler's new job, about nothing important at all, which was exactly the kind of ordinary closeness I had been missing for the better part of a year. Forgiveness for me is not a single dramatic gesture. It is a door I am willing to open again, slowly, for people who show me, through their actions over time, that they understand what went wrong. I think, too, about a quiet conversation I had with my younger sister Dorothy on the phone one evening not long after the wedding, when she asked me whether I regretted any part of what I had done. I told her honestly that I regretted the pain it caused Tyler and Emily, who did not deserve to inherit a fight that was never truly theirs, but that I did not regret even slightly the moment I finally stopped confusing my own worth with the size of the checks I was willing to write. Dorothy laughed softly on the other end of the line and told me our own mother would have been proud of me, a comment that settled somewhere warm in my chest for days afterward. What I will not do, and I want to say this plainly for anyone listening who finds themselves in a similar position, is simply return to being an unlimited resource for people who have not yet fully reckoned with how they treated me. I still help my family when I'm able to, and when I'm asked with genuine respect rather than quiet assumption. But I keep my own accounts more carefully now, my own name clearly attached to whatever I give, and I ask myself before writing any check whether the people receiving it have shown me recently and consistently that they see me as a whole person, not simply as a source of funds who happens to also enjoy pot roast on Sunday afternoons. I think often about that manila folder in my desk drawer, the one where I first laid out those contracts in the gray hour before dawn, weeks before the wedding that never quite happened the way anyone originally planned. I do not regret organizing my finances that carefully. I do not regret understanding my own legal rights clearly, the way my late husband Robert always encouraged me to, reminding me constantly during our 35 years together that a woman should always know exactly where her own name sits on any piece of paper she signs. That habit, born out of simple practicality, ended up protecting my dignity in a moment when nothing else in that family was prepared to. A few months after the wedding, Tyler and Emily held a small backyard gathering of their own. No venue rented, no caterer hired, just folding tables borrowed from Emily's church, and a grill James manned all afternoon. And this time I was seated quite deliberately at the head of the table, beside the two of them. A small gesture I understood to be Tyler's own quiet apology, offered in the only language that ever really mattered between us. Simple presence, freely given. I brought a pot roast that day, the same recipe I used to make on those long-ago Sunday afternoons, and watching Tyler take a second helping without being asked told me more about where we stood than any speech could have. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story, whatever your own age, whatever your own family situation, it is this: love someone with your whole heart if that is who you are. Give generously if generosity genuinely brings you joy, but never let your generosity become the very leash by which people decide when you are permitted to belong. I paid for that family's parties quite literally for most of a decade. On that particular day, I finally decided to stop paying for my own exclusion from one of them, and in doing so, I found a version of myself I had honestly forgotten still existed underneath all those years of quiet giving. I am 78 years old, and I still have a great deal of love left to give this family, but I give it now, with my eyes open, and with my own name clearly written wherever it needs to be written, for my own protection as much as anyone else's benefit. Some nights, sitting on that same back porch where Robert and I used to drink our morning coffee, I still think about the woman I was the day I signed that first venue contract, so certain that love alone would be enough to secure my place at my own grandson's wedding, and I feel a kind of tenderness toward her rather than embarrassment because she was only doing what she had always known how to do, and she needed this whole hard year to learn the rest. If this story moves something in you, if you recognized even a small piece of your own life inside mine, I hope you will subscribe to this channel and share this story with someone who might need to hear it today, someone who has perhaps forgotten, the way I nearly did, that being generous and being disposable are never supposed to be the same thing. Leave a comment below and tell me if you have ever had to draw a boundary with your own family, even a small one, because I read every single one of them, and I promise you, whatever you write, an old woman on Maple Court will be nodding along with you. Thank you for listening to my story and for staying with an old woman all the way to the end of it.